Well, hello, this is Scott Phillips. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and as Ken mentioned, we both coordinate our Chesapeake efforts. Ken took you through the trend results, and I'm going to talk about the drivers affecting these trends. So, from this graphic, there's three main factors affecting the trends of nutrients in the watershed: how the sources change, the best management practices, and how nutrients are transported. And we'll go through each of these in some examples, but the main sources we're going to talk about are nutrients that come from wastewater, agricultural lands, urban development, air deposition. Then we'll talk about how management practices either try to reduce those sources or retain the nutrients from not reaching waterways. Then finally, talk a little bit about the transport of those sources. That is, sources further from the watershed, those nutrients usually decrease as they move towards the bay. The nutrients can also be affected by legacy nutrients, that is, nitrogen going through the groundwater can take a while to move to a water body, or phosphorus can be stored in a field. And then finally, climate change is having an effect on the trends that we're going to present. So let's first talk about wastewater and air deposition. So wastewater and atmospheric deposition reductions have improved water quality. Uh, Wastewater point sources have been reduced for phosphorus, and that's shown in this upper slide, where we see phosphorus reductions from the mid 80s all the way through to present. And a lot of those reductions were from the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, where we put in a phosphorus detergent ban in 1987, and you can see its effectiveness. For nitrogen, we've also seen reductions in point sources. And together, these reductions have improved the downstream water quality, with the Potomac River and Patuxent River being two prime examples. Now, in addition to wastewater plant upgrades, we've also seen reductions in nitrogen from air emissions. And that's shown here on this graph, where improvements for emissions from coal-fired power plants, as well as reductions from cars, have led to this overall reduction of nitrogen falling on the Bay watershed. And most of those improvements we're seeing are in forested areas because they're not affected by other sources. Overall, this atmospheric reduction probably explains about 13 to 14% of nitrogen going to the bay. In urban areas, land use change affects the trends. And overall, about 27% of the lands over the past 30 years have become urbanized. We've seen that trends in these urban areas can be mixed. One example here is Accotink Creek, where we've actually seen an improving trend for nitrogen over time. We haven't seen a large change in the land use, so it implies that best management practices are contributing to this improvement. Whereas Difficult Run, we've seen a worsening trend over time. And this is where we have increasing urbanization in this watershed, which has led to that degradation. The other thing we see is the previous land use can make a difference in these urban areas. Where you have a forested area, which then becomes urbanized, we usually see an increase in nitrogen loads. But where you had an agricultural area, which now has become a suburban subdivision, you can see a decrease in nitrogen loads. And that's because there's just less being applied to the land surface. Let's talk about agricultural areas. The trends in these agricultural watersheds are mixed, and they're affected by multiple factors. The three factors we're going to talk about is mostly what's applied to the land surface, with a focus on manure and fertilizer, the types and effectiveness of management practices, and then legacy nutrients. So let's look at this first site on the lower right-hand side. This is the Conestoga River in Pennsylvania. It's in the lower Susquehanna Basin. And if you remember from Ken's diagram, a lot of those sites were improving for nitrogen, and that's what we see here, an improving nitrogen condition, that is a lower amount of load. Now, if you look at the inputs, fertilizer stayed pretty constant over time. We've had a slight increase in manure. So this improvement we're seeing is from implementation of best management practices, retaining those nutrients from reaching streams. In this area also, nitrogen in groundwater moves pretty quickly because it's a karst area. So you don't have a long lag time between putting in practices and seeing water quality improvements. We have a opposite situation, this upper graph, and this is for phosphorus in the Choptank River. In this graph from the mid 80s through 2018, phosphorus is actually worsening or increasing in this river. Some of that increase we feel is due to the increased amount of manure being put in, even though you've had less fertilizer. And also, those increasing sources can offset BMPs that might be put into that watershed, which there have been many. We think one of the main factors is the legacy nutrients. That is, phosphorus can be stored in the soils and continually wash down the river. So even if you put practices in to reduce the phosphorus being applied, it can still move downstream and cause these increasing trends. Climate change will also affect nutrient trends and delivery. We're seeing increasing amounts of rainfall and rising temperatures that can cause more storm events that can bring phosphorus and nitrogen down the bay watershed during those events. And it also can affect the amount of annual river flow to the bay. And that's what this graph is on the bottom. This is a graph of how much river flow goes in the bay from 1935 through 2019. And you can see that the river flows become more variable here after 1970 and has continued that way for the past 50 years. This more variable river flow affects the amount of nutrients and sediment that are delivered to the bay, which ultimately affect achievement of our water quality standards. So most of the focus now is really trying to manage non-point sources of nutrients in urban and agricultural areas. So even though the implementation is increasing across the watershed of management practices, we don't always see the expected improvement in nutrient trends. And there's four things we think are contributing to that. One is just unrealistic expectations of these nutrient reductions. A lot of the BMP efficiencies are based on field studies in limited areas. So when you put those practices in this really complex watershed, you don't necessarily get the efficiency you expect everywhere. Secondly, it's competing factors. As we mentioned before, you can put management practices in an area, but if the sources of nutrients are still increasing, whether it's from urbanization or agriculture, it can offset those improvements you hope to see from BMPs. We've mentioned travel time and the effect of legacy sediments can cause a lag time between putting in a practice and seeing a water quality improvement. And finally, there's also cases of insufficient monitoring. Most of our monitoring that Ken showed is at the watershed scale, where we might be monitoring basins of 100 square miles or larger. But to detect this change in water quality from different types of practices, you really need to get down to smaller scales, which we don't have currently, but we are trying to achieve that. So a summary of some of the messages we've gone through today. We've got mixed results for nitrogen and phosphorus trends. Point source improvements and reductions in air emissions are improving water quality. Trends in urban watersheds are affected by land use change and the previous land use condition. We are seeing multiple factors affecting trends in agricultural watersheds, and trying to achieve these non-point source reductions are going to be challenging. We are conducting science to inform these nutrient reduction efforts. And over the next 4 years, there will be science to really sustain and enhance the monitoring we're doing of nutrients, analysis and reporting those results, continue to explain what's affecting those trends, and relating that how water quality can also improve other habitat conditions such as streams. If you want more information on the studies, feel free to look at these different areas here. And we really appreciate your time today, and reach out if you do have more questions in the future. Thank you.